April 6, 1945. The Japanese super battleship Yamato heads for the fight of its life. Destination, Okinawa Island, where American troops have landed. But the largest, most powerful warship ever built, and Japan's last hope, may be facing its final mission in the waning days of World War II. Japan's strategy? To force the Americans into an epic naval confrontation with its super battleship, its massive artillery, and unrivaled firepower. But the Americans have a new weapon of their own, the aircraft carrier. It's a potential game changer, allowing their fighter bombers to attack from the air. It's a duel to the death in the heart of the Pacific. The epic of the super battleships begins in October 1935. Japanese engineers have begun building an enormous new vessel. It will have no weight or size limits. And it will have an asymmetrical look. Their goal is to build warships with weaponry surpassing that of any other nation. Ships whose size will be unmatched for years to come. The prototype will be called Yamato.
The production facilities behind me were the Kure Naval Arsenal in those days. Its dockyard saw the birth of battleship Yamato. Her keel was laid in 1937, and the ship was completed in 1941. Yamato was the heaviest battleship in the world. Back then, the total construction expenses amounted to 130 million yen. That would be over 1 trillion yen, $8 billion in today's prices.
The Japanese assume that an industrial power like the United States might have the means to build a larger fleet than their own, but nothing with the kind of firepower that would top their own super battleships. Naval victories like the one at Tsushima in 1905 against the Russians prompted them to devise what they thought was a foolproof plan, forcing the entire American fleet into an unwinnable naval battle with Yamato and her sister ship, Musashi. Crushing the U.S. would mean dominating the Pacific.
In late 1941, Japan began an offensive that we refer to as the centrifugal offensive. What the Japanese imagined was in Asia, a sphere of influence that was utterly and completely dominated by the Empire of Japan. But in order to create that, they had to shove the Europeans and the North Americans out of the way.
The name Yamato comes from an ancient Japanese word meaning perfect harmony. From start to finish, the ship's construction is shrouded in secrecy. High fences surround the shipyard. Engineers are forbidden from discussing their work with anyone, even family. And workers are carefully monitored as they come and go from the site at Kure. These measures will keep this extraordinary construction project fully under wraps. Yamato weighs more than 72,000 tons in combat order, 20,000 more than the German battleship Bismarck. It's 263 meters long, and almost 40 wide. Its draft is nearly 11 meters, the height of a 5-story building. Its main belt armor is 270 to 410 millimeters thick. The gun turret armor between 190 and 650 millimeters thick. The command post 300 to 500 millimeters. 4 steam turbines and 12 Campon boilers produce 150,000 horsepower and propel it to a maximum speed of 27 knots. And it can hold 7 reconnaissance seaplanes. Its range, 11,500 kilometers at 16 knots. When they were launched in 1940, Yamato and her sister ship Musashi were unrivaled. America's heaviest battleships at the time, the South Dakota class, were only half their weight at 35,000 tons combat ready. In early 1943, the Navy launches Iowa, the first battleship of its class. Though it's still 20,000 tons lighter than the Japanese giants and less heavily armed. Yamato's primary armament? 9 Type 94 460mm guns, mounted in 3 triple turrets. The ship's secondary armament? 12 Type 3 150mm guns, mounted in 4 triple turrets. For anti-aircraft defense, the ship is armed with 12 Type 89 127mm guns in 6 double turrets. And finally, 50 Type 96 25mm guns.
Yamato's key features are her main turrets, each having 3 460mm guns. The guns could fire shells weighing almost 1.5 tons with a muzzle speed of 790 meters per second. A gun turret, including the barbette, weighed 3,000 tons. It could contain over 150 men.
Better yet, Yamato's main batteries function with a fire control system. Its 2 electromechanical calculators, forerunners of the computer, gauge a target's speed and direction and provide a quick and accurate firing solution. During World War II, the 2 Yamato-class ships are also equipped with radar for surveillance and detection of surface targets. Yamato's 460mm guns can fire armor-piercing shells the weight of an automobile at the rate of 2 rounds per minute and a record distance of 42 kilometers. Which means that Yamato can fire off 9 to 13 tons of ammunition in a single minute of combat. But the super battleship does have an Achilles heel, its anti-aircraft defense. At its launch, Yamato has been fitted with 6 127mm double mounts, 3 on the port side and 3 on starboard, firing shells up to 23 kilos each. Effective by 1941 standards, but not entirely adequate for protecting the ship in 1945.
The 127mm anti-aircraft guns and the 25mm guns had different ranges of fire. So if an enemy aircraft flew into this gap, neither of the guns was able to effectively intercept it. Furthermore, the 127mm guns had relatively low traverse speed and poor elevation and depression characteristics. They also failed to fire at the declared rate of 14 rounds per minute if the elevation was high or low.
Yamato's final defense against aerial attack was 24 Type 96 25mm autocannons, configured in 8 mounts of 3 guns. But they too had some notable shortcomings. The firing rate of the Type 96 was slow, at just 130 rounds per minute, limiting its volume of fire. and its 15-round magazines required continuous reloading by ammunition handlers, whereas the Allies had Swiss-made Oerlikon 20mm guns that fired 250 to 350 rounds per minute. In addition, Yamato's Type 96 mounts were incapable of sufficient elevation and notorious for failing to traverse and track targets swiftly enough. Unfortunate weaknesses in the ship's air defense by 1945, when the sky was filled with U.S. Navy warplanes.
The Japanese commissioned Yamato and Musashi, the super battleships, and they commissioned them with a critical weakness in terms of anti-aircraft armament. And there's a reason for that. They were weapons of war that were created in a bygone era, because Yamato was born in the time period before high-performance aircraft existed. So when those ships were born, they were born into this era of biplanes. What the Japanese didn't really imagine was a future in which torpedo-bombing aircraft would roar in at almost 300 miles an hour at an altitude of 3,000 or 4,000 feet, releasing torpedoes that could destroy a ship. That was a reality that might have been the subject of a fantasy novel circa 1935.
But Yamato looked impenetrable. Its belt armor was 100 millimeters thicker than that of the battleship Iowa, its American adversary. Armor plating, covering almost half the ship, transformed it into a fortress, topped by a heavily fortified command post. And the ship boasted the most powerful weaponry of any warship from World War II.
The breech-loading rifles this ship mounted as its primary armament were the largest weapons being used by any ship on planet Earth at the time. Those ships that were conceived in the pre-war time period when there was a thought to this idea that massive battleships were still the primary weapon of naval warfare. Japan could only afford one type of war, and that was quick and clean. The war that they could not possibly win in a million years was the protracted war of attrition, and that is exactly what the American nation gave them.
Initially, Japan planned to build a total of 4 Yamato-class ships. However, the Pacific War began, and after completing the second ship, Musashi, Japan stopped building the third ship, Shinano, and never started the fourth one. Eventually, Shinano was converted to an aircraft carrier.
Commissioned in December 1941, Yamato is Admiral Yamamoto's flagship during the Battle of Midway in June 1942. As the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Imperial Navy Combined Fleet, he masterminded the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The Battle of Midway was the most significant moment for the United States Navy during the Second World War. What the Japanese didn't think would happen is that the United States of America is ready to fight, and ready to fight back, and fight all the way to the end of the line, all the way to a final decisive defeat of the Empire of Japan. They expected that they might see a patrol plane kind of snooping off in the distance. Okay, we've been spotted, that's not a big deal, we're ready for this. We're bringing greater numbers to this battle. We're going to outnumber the Americans. And instead, as the day unfolds, they're not outnumbering us. They're finding that we're throwing numbers into this game, and that is definitely not what Japan thought we were going to do. So in absolutely every way, the Battle of Midway marks the decisive turning point of the war in the Pacific.
The Japanese planned 2 simultaneous attacks, one on the Aleutian Islands and one against Midway. The goal? To force the Navy into the pivotal battle they're convinced the Americans will lose. On June 4th, 1942, Yamato has yet to fire a single round. 185 kilometers still lie between the enemy fleets. But what is about to unfold is the decisive naval action of the entire conflict. At 5 a.m., an American reconnaissance aircraft spots the enemy fleet. 2 hours into the Battle of Midway, U.S. torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier Hornet are the first to reach their target. Without an escort, the Navy's obsolescent Devastator torpedo bombers suffer heavy casualties from Japanese anti-aircraft fire. But they divert enemy fighters, clearing the way for the next airstrike, especially from the Navy's SBD Dauntless dive bombers. The aircraft rain fire on the Japanese task force. When the air raid winds down an hour later, only the carrier Hiryu is still able to launch aircraft. By dusk, the Japanese have lost the aircraft carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, either crippled or sunk by the Americans. The Battle of Midway is a huge win for the Navy, but also reveals a weakness in American naval aviation. In attack mode, traveling at 200 kilometers an hour, the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber is simply too slow. Japanese gunners can pick them off. Of the 41 aircraft in the battle, the U.S. loses 35. Torpedoes were highly effective weapons for sinking ships, but needed an upgraded delivery system. When a freefall bomb is dropped from high up, it must strike a moving target just 30 meters wide. But a torpedo launched from a fast-moving aircraft would only have to hit the broad flank of a slow-moving ship, thus increasing its chances of doing maximum damage. The Battle of Midway is disastrous for the Japanese, who lose 4 aircraft carriers, more than 300 aircraft, and a huge number of experienced pilots. Without air cover, Japanese ships are extremely vulnerable targets.
Yamato had been present at the Battle of Midway and it never fired a shot. And in the aftermath of the battle, the Japanese suddenly became very cautious about governing that ship and protecting that ship. Same applied to Musashi. There are wicked battles being fought elsewhere that Yamato does not participate in. Because at this stage, there is a recognition for the fact that in building super battleships, the Japanese might have invested money in something that's not going to pay a big dividend.
On August 17, 1942, Yamato sets off for Truk Lagoon. It anchors there for close to a year as battle rages 2,000 kilometers away at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The U.S. needs to stop Japanese southward expansion before it can launch a counteroffensive to take back the Pacific. On October 11, 1942, less than a year after the Pearl Harbor attack and only 3 months after the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy proves that it's a match for the Japanese Imperial Navy. It stops an attempt to reinforce and resupply Japanese Army forces on Guadalcanal. 20 American ships, including 1 aircraft carrier, 2 battleships, 2 heavy and 3 light cruisers are committed. As fighting continues across Guadalcanal, Yamato is still sitting out the war at Truk Lagoon. American bombardments disrupt critical supply lines of fuel oil, crippling the super battleship, which burns 60 tons an hour at sea. And without any ammunition for bombardment of shore positions, the ship won't see action again until May 1943. After a year at anchor, Japanese crews mockingly call it Hotel Yamato.
Japanese sailors would ultimately grow a little disillusioned, especially about Yamato. There's the famous quote of the 3 most useless things on Earth are the Great Wall of China, the pyramids at the Giza necropolis, and the battleship Yamato.
In October 1944, the Imperial Navy finally redeploys Yamato and her sister ship Musashi in the war effort. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippine Sea, the invincibility of Japan's super battleships against air power is put to the test. During this epic confrontation, Yamato fires its main guns. But as the ships are in constant motion dodging enemy torpedoes, it doesn't change the outcome of the battle. The gunners are having trouble keeping up with the swarm of targets. And several hours into the battle, Musashi is sunk by carrier-based aircraft. Tsukada Yoshiaki was an anti-aircraft gunner aboard Musashi.
During the enemy aerial attack in the Sibuyan Sea, a bomb struck near the bridge and damaged the gun control device. Shortly after, a torpedo struck near the starboard side, right under my nose. I would assume this damage also cut off the auxiliary signal circuits. As a result, not a single command could be relayed to anti-aircraft guns, where they had to be manually controlled individually.
It takes 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes to sink the enormous ship. Of the 2,900 sailors aboard, 1,000 men perish. The others are rescued.
By this time, many survivors climbed out from inside the hull and gathered on the deck. They were shocked to see the Musashi's deck riddled with holes and the bridge in ruins. The majority of the crews on board had no way of knowing of the Musashi's condition. My senior officer, carrying a frightened young soldier, was the first to take the jump. Everyone else followed his lead. I was lucky enough to land on the water, but many of my comrades were not so fortunate. I've heard many were torn with the sharp edges of the shell holes. Later, I was rescued by the destroyer Hamakaze's cutter boat. I've later learned that out of the 11 men in my squad, 9 survived. My senior officer and the young soldier with him were deemed missing in action.
The Musashi wreckage was found in 2015 by the late billionaire Paul Allen's research team, 1,000 meters deep off the Philippine coast. Yamato escapes relatively unscathed from the battle, but now no one thinks it's unsinkable. Pressing their advantage, the Americans lean further into their winning strategy: dominate the seas by commanding the skies. The backbone of the Navy's strength will be a new class of aircraft carrier. USS Essex, launched in July 1942, is the first of the legendary series, followed by USS Yorktown in 1943.
The United States jumped on board the arms race, and we begin building longer, heavier, wider aircraft carriers in response. With the Essex-class carriers, though, we sought to establish the perfect class of aircraft carriers designed from the bottom up to fight in that role. There were, in other words, a number of technical innovations that would make the Essex-class carriers a generation evolved and therefore better than their predecessors.
Yorktown is 266 meters long and 45 wide. Its hull 25 meters, or 8 stories high. Weight 36,000 tons. Draft 8.4 meters. Powered by 8 boilers and 4 Westinghouse steam turbines, with a capacity of 150,000 horsepower and maximum speed of 33 knots, or 61 kilometers per hour. Its anti-aircraft armament consists of 4 127mm double guns, 17 quadruple 40mm guns, and 51 Oerlikon Mk4 20mm guns. Its armor plating is impressive, 64 to 102 millimeters in belt armor, 37 millimeters for the cockpit. The ship's air group consists of around 100 aircraft, F-6F Hellcats, SB-2C Helldivers, and TBM Avengers. Radius of action of the aircraft carrier, 15,000 nautical miles, or 27,780 kilometers.
When the United States imagines the Essex-class Yorktown, the United States was recognizing that what we need is a blueprint for the ultimate battleship that can be repeated over and over again. And then, ultimately, by the time it's done, 24 Essex-class carriers will have been built. And the fact that so many of them get made during such a short period of time is really an accomplishment of not just engineering, but also mass production. And in many ways, the United States is the only country that can pull that off. Japan doesn't have the resources to do it.
While the U.S. produces scores of new aircraft carriers during the war, by the end of 1944, the Japanese cannot replace their combat losses.
You have to imagine the shock that they must have felt when suddenly they're dealing with not just high-performance aircraft, but an enemy who can bring them across the Pacific Ocean to your doorstep. The Japanese couldn't imagine a reality in which that enemy could project that power all the way across the Pacific Ocean and achieve not just air superiority, but ultimately even air supremacy.
Yamato returns to Kure on November 23, 1944, to refit in dry dock. Its anti-aircraft defense armament is increased to 162 guns. Japanese naval strategists know that another American air raid might destroy their last super battleship, so they'll try to slow the advance of the enemy fleet from the skies, using inexperienced pilots on suicide missions to defend the empire, the kamikazes.
Kamikaze means divine wind. And in this continuum of time, this race against time, the Japanese realized the best weapon we have at our disposal is the determined pilot who can crash an aircraft into a ship and sink it. This illustrates here, just in the example of Yamato, how much things had changed from 1935 to 1945.
Out of dry dock in early January 1945, Yamato was attacked at anchor on March 19th. The port of Kure is the target of a massive airborne operation. 321 aircraft are launched from 7 American aircraft carrier task forces. Yamato survives, thanks primarily to anti-aircraft batteries stationed on the island. But the Americans are getting dangerously close to the south shores of Japan. In February 1945, the Marines land at Iwo Jima And on April 1st, Army and Marine divisions begin landing on Okinawa, only 550 kilometers from Kyushu. Possession of the island would allow the Americans to cut off the supply route between Japan and Southeast China. And Okinawa would become an important U.S. base of operations for the final Allied offensive to topple the Japanese Empire. The greatest amphibious assault of the Pacific War begins that day, April 1st, 1945. 330 warships and over 1,000 Allied transport ships are mobilized, even more than had fought at Operation Overlord in Normandy the previous year. That day, 50,000 soldiers and Marines land on Okinawa and establish a beachhead more than 14 kilometers wide and 4 deep. But the Japanese resist for weeks, with suicide motorboats and kamikazes. On April 6, Japan launches its first large-scale counterattack. 400 kamikaze pilots take off from airfields on Kyushu. Their sole mission: crashing their planes loaded with explosives into the decks of enemy ships.
The Japanese didn't think it was all over. So for the Japanese, sending that warship down to Okinawa to beach itself and contribute fire, it's cold calculation. And they were having to confront a lot of cold numbers, which is why they began the incredibly successful kamikaze program.
.250 kamikaze aircraft are destroyed in flight, but others hit their targets. Among them, the carrier USS Hancock. But is it enough to stop the U.S. Navy? The Strategic Air War finally comes to Tokyo in mid-March. American B-29s raised 16 square kilometers of the capital, killing 100,000 people. The air raid sends a clear message to Japan's leaders as the empire reels from its losses.
What motivated the plan to begin with was that the United States wanted to prove to the Japanese that we could hit them, and that we could hit them soon. And bombs actually fall on the city of Tokyo, and that changes the Japanese mind about the war that they're now a part of. The Japanese realize, well, we need to put out a protective, defensive cordon, a barrier across the center of the Pacific Ocean, so that the Americans can never do that again.
Too late, Japan realizes that they've underestimated America's ability to retaliate against their Navy. Now they'll have to rely on a land-based defense and kamikaze attacks to protect Okinawa while they reorganize. But Emperor Hirohito is unwilling to sacrifice his army while his Imperial Navy stands by. He orders them into battle in Operation Tengo, a small naval task force spearheaded by Yamato. It's a desperate measure, sealing the fate of one of history's greatest battleships. Only a few surface vessels escort Yamato into battle off the coast of Okinawa. This mission, to attack the enemy fleet, inflict as much damage as possible, and beach Yamato. Yamato and any surviving ships will then serve as artillery platforms until they're obliterated. At first, Yamato's commanding officer, Vice Admiral Ito, refuses to execute this plan, calling it an enormous waste. But out of duty, he complies with the Emperor's order. At dawn on April 6, 1945, Yamato, escorted by a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, weighs anchor and heads for a day-long crossing to Okinawa. This is probably a voyage of no return, and the men aboard Yamato are well aware of that. Admiral Raymond Spruance commands the American naval forces off Okinawa. He orders Task Force 54, 6 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 21 destroyers to head north to intercept the battleship Yamato and its escort. Meanwhile, acting on loose orders, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, a pioneer in naval aviation, seizes the opportunity to get there first. He's commander of Task Force 58 and its 11 aircraft carriers, including Essex and Yorktown II. Admiral Spruance is convinced that the opportunity to engage Yamato in a classic naval battle will be his. He orders the battleships of Task Force 54 to prepare to fight and sink the last of Japan's giant warships. But Mitcher has other ideas. This is the perfect opportunity for him to prove that his aircraft carriers, with their formidable firepower, are superior to Admiral Spruance's battleships. What better proof than to have his air groups destroy the symbol of Japanese naval power? In early 1943, the Navy's Dauntless and F-4F Wildcat were being phased out. Essex-class aircraft carriers were the first to fly the new Avenger torpedo bombers. The Grumman TBF-TBM Avenger weighs more than 8 tons in combat order. Engine output, 1,900 horsepower for a maximum speed of 444 kilometers per hour. Armament, 2 12.7mm machine guns fore, 1 M2 Browning 12.7mm machine gun aft, and 1 Browning 30 caliber machine gun. 1 torpedo or 1 900-kilogram bomb, and 8 127mm rockets under the wings. April 7, 1945, at 10 a.m., the first wave of 132 fighters, 50 dive bombers, and 98 torpedo bombers takes off. The reconnaissance aircraft of the carrier Essex have located their targets, and the American pilots now have exact coordinates of the Japanese task force. But they're still 450 kilometers away. More than 200 aircraft take part in the action. The battle begins at 12:34. Seven minutes later, 2 bombs hit Yamato, followed almost immediately by 2 more. The first torpedo strikes at 12:43. Before they withdraw at 12:50, the first wave of American warplanes takes out a light destroyer and heavily damages 3 other destroyers. Yamato fights on, but the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners are in deep trouble. On this April day, the cloud cover is extremely low over the Japanese fleet, as American fighter planes start to surge out of the skies. Without fire-controlled radar, it's impossible for Yamato's gunners to calculate the distances that separate them from enemy aircraft and adjust their targets. The Americans soon realize that the enemy is shooting blind. Japanese ammunition explodes too soon or too late, almost never hitting the target. The Navy pilots swarm the battleship. As pilots search for breaks in the clouds, the risk of mid-air collision is far greater than being taken out by the enemy. Fighters and bombers dive randomly through tiny gaps in the overcast, sometimes wing to wing. If they lose sight of their targets, they must course correct last minute when visibility is reestablished. The radio waves erupt in a frenzy of calls with target coordinates, distress calls, and elated cheers when the bombs explode. It's a total free-for-all. The task force had coordinated airstrikes on Yamato, but in the heat of the moment, the American pilots are just going for it. Each leader wants his group to be the first to deal the death blow. Aircraft come thundering in at low altitude over the distressed super battleship. F-6F Hellcat and Corsair fighters strafe the ship's decks, killing every last gunner. Plunging from directly over Yamato, Curtiss Helldivers drop their loads and pull out before the Japanese can aim and fire. "12 minutes after the first attack, a second wave appears. Avengers send torpedoes slicing through the waves, aimed at the Japanese ships. "20 are launched at Yamato. 4 hit their mark. Suddenly, a third wave of more than 100 U.S. warplanes appears on the horizon. Among them, a group from the aircraft carrier Yorktown. 43 Hellcats and Avengers under the command of Captain Herbert Hoke.
The first bombs strike the ship around 12:37 p.m. on Saturday, April 7th. And during the time period that elapses, then eventually, some sources say 11 torpedoes, some sources say 13 torpedoes struck the ship. As many as 6 bombs strike the ship. And over the span of the time period between 12:37 p.m. and 2:23 p.m., Yamato is just hammered over and over again by a force of almost 300 aircraft. And the fact that that ship survived as long as it did under that kind of punishment is a tribute to how well designed it was.
In under 2 hours, the Navy destroys the automatic fire control systems of Yamato's anti-aircraft guns. Now, they can only be directed individually, using a sight and firing manually. It's Captain Hoke's men who finally deliver the coup de grace. Yamato lists dangerously to port.
In order to counterbalance and correct that heavy list, something that you have to do to prevent capsizing, Rear Admiral Arriga ordered the flooding, the counter-flooding of the engine compartment. And he knows that in ordering this done, that it will right the list and prevent the ship from capsizing. But he also knows that the timing was such that he couldn't delay to allow the engine room crew to escape from the compartment. And he had to do it, and he had to do it immediately. And these are the hard, lonesome decisions that commanders have to make in battle. And in ordering that, he saved the ship. He made it possible for the ship to live, what, another hour? But in issuing that order, he also condemned over 300 men to die trapped behind watertight compartments from which they could not escape.
For 30 minutes, Yamato stabilizes, but then at 2:05 begins to capsize. At 2:23, the ship suddenly explodes. The pillar of fire created by the explosion can be seen more than 250 kilometers away on Kyushu. A mushroom cloud of smoke, almost 6,000 meters high, rises over the battleship that's sinking into the East China Sea. Of Yamato's nearly 3,000-man crew, there are only 276 survivors. Over the course of the fight, the Americans lose 10 aircraft, 4 Helldivers, 3 Avengers, 3 Hellcats. 12 pilots and crew members lose their lives. Minimal losses for now, but the Battle of Okinawa has only just begun. While Yamato is in its death throes, Japanese aircraft attack the American fleet at Okinawa. 115 aircraft, most of them kamikazes, descend on the enemy throughout the day of April 7th. It's the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Kamikaze pilots hit the aircraft carrier Hancock, the battleship Maryland, and the destroyer Bennett. Hancock and Maryland suffer moderate damage, yet there are heavy casualties on Bennett. But in this last major battle of World War II, it's a day of staggering loss for Japan. The Americans add 100 more enemy aircraft and their pilots to their scoreboard. Among those who choose to go down with Yamato is Vice Admiral Ito, the commander who had predicted that this risky mission would lead to nothing but needless sacrifice. Yamato's end marks the turning point when the golden age of battleships gives way to a new and different style of warfare.
At the same time that the United States imagines the perfect category of aircraft carrier, what's Japan doing? It's imagining super battleships. And right there, you identify two dramatically opposed ideas of what modern naval warfare will be. They thought that the big gun solves all problems. And it didn't hurt at all, too, that big, beautiful battleships also promoted morale and prestige. They looked good, not just in terms of the grit and bravery of doing something like that, but also the technical skill it takes to design something like that. The reality was that battleship is no longer the god of naval warfare. It's the aircraft carrier.
In Tokyo, the Navy minister delivers the news of Operation Tengo's epic failure to Emperor Hirohito. But it's as if the emperor hasn't heard, when he again demands a status report, unwilling, perhaps, to accept that Yamato and all of his men are gone. The super battleship Yamato still lies deep on the ocean floor. When it was lost that fateful day in 1945, the Japanese Imperial Navy vanished with it.